The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly onpoli podcast.
You know, in a perfect world, there might be a better argument for decriminalization if we had, robust wraparound social services for people who are using drugs and people who are addicted. I'm not going to scandalize anybody by saying those wraparound services do not currently exist in Ontario.
How's it going, partner?
Good. A bit of a quiet week in Ontario politics. The legislature isn't actually sitting this week, but not so at the mother of parliaments. With British politics, the
Yes.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called a snap election. And it did have me wondering, I've only ever covered Ontario politics in the era of fixed election date laws. 2014, a bit of an exception there, but otherwise, I was curious. Do you miss the era of the feverish speculation about when will the premier call an election and all of that energy about snap elections? Do you miss that?
No. No. I used to think there was a great deal of effort and Sturm and Drang, if I can use that expression, around when's he going to call the election? Is he calling it this week? Is he calling it next week? Does this policy get introduced because he's got an election? Anyway, there was way too much effort worrying about when the election was going to be called. But I will say this. It's kind of neat that this guy has called the British Prime Minister has called this election right out of the blue. Nobody was expecting it. He's 20 points down. Most people think it's a sort of a suicide mission. Yeah. But, you never know about these things.
No, the campaign will be fun to watch. I mean, we have a day job, but I will be keeping one eye on British politics for the next little while. Election day in the United Kingdom, July 4th. And, as I say, I'll be interested to see how that all turns out.
July 4th was not a great day for Great Britain, as I recall, in 1776. But I don't know. We'll see how it goes this time.
I can't imagine why they picked that date. I'm sure there was some reason, but they've done it now.
Away we go. Anyways, on to issue one. In 2021, the Ontario government introduced and passed changes to the province's campaign finance laws. And for the first time since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was adopted in 1982, the Ontario legislature invoked the notwithstanding clause to shield the law from judicial review. But the courts have reviewed the law anyway, and this week the legislation was before the Supreme Court of Canada. JMM, you were watching the proceedings. What do you want to tell us?
Well, so this case has actually been running for years, depending on where you started. It actually predates the Ford government entirely. But I'm going to try and summarize these things fairly and succinctly if I can. So as you say, in 2021, the Ford government introduced this bill to impose new spending limits on third parties. That's anybody in an election who isn't a registered political party. The Bill 254, which they introduced in 2021, extended third-party spending limits from 6 months to 12 months and did not increase the dollar amount that those third parties were allowed to spend. So a pretty substantial restriction on the speech rights of third parties in Ontario elections.
For sure. Now, the political context is obviously important here. Everyone more or less acknowledges that this was aimed specifically at groups such as working families, which was an incredibly successful attempt to, I guess, put together an alliance of public sector unions and run very tough ad campaigns against exclusively the Progressive Conservative Party. They were always couched as nonpartisan campaigns, but frankly, they were ads directed right at the PC party, mostly to the benefit of the Liberals, right?
Yes, this was hardly a secret when the government introduced this legislation. In 2021, however, an Ontario court struck down the crucial bits that we're talking about here about Bill 254, saying that they improperly infringed people's free speech rights under the Charter. In June of that year, the Ford government reenacted those changes with Bill 307. this time invoking the notwithstanding clause, section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
And presumably the fact that the court is considering all of this and you and I are talking about it means that the discussion is not over.
Right. It did not end there. So I'm going to just do a little bit of remedial civics here.
We love remedial civics.
It's one of our specialties here. So the notwithstanding clause allows the federal parliament or any provincial legislature to declare that a law operates notwithstanding some parts of the charter, but it's not a total blank check. You can't use Section 33 to restrict people's voting rights or their mobility rights, and you can't use it to override rules about how long legislatures can go between elections or without sitting at all. So, the notwithstanding clause was a key part of the political bargain that got us the charter in the first place, but nobody wanted to give a provincial premier the right to make himself, dictator for life.
No, we don't like that here.
No.
So anyway, okay, so back on campaign finance laws, what's the latest?
Right. So the same public sector unions who had initially fought third-party spending limits, they quickly went back to court after the legislature passed Bill 307, arguing that the changes weren't just a restriction on their free speech rights, but in fact amounted to an attack on Ontarians' right to cast an informed vote.
Okay, so let's understand this. Free speech cases, the notwithstanding clause wins the day.
Yeah.
However, if it's about voting rights, Ontario, or any other province for that matter, cannot use the notwithstanding clause.
Exactly.
Yes, okay.
So the first Ontario court that heard this argument dismissed it, saying that this is a free speech case, not a voting rights case, and the notwithstanding clause applied, and there was nothing really more to say. Things got more interesting at the Ontario Court of Appeal, where a majority of judges there held that it was, in fact, a voting rights issue. They accepted that argument, and in that case, the notwithstanding clause was not permissible, or the government could not invoke it there. They declared the law null and void. Not surprisingly, the government appealed that decision to the Supreme Court of Canada, which is how we found ourselves there this week.
Now, the country's highest court does not usually announce a decision on the same day that they hear arguments, and they held to that practice this time as well. Now, you listened to the arguments over the last couple of days. I know you always like to remind us. I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV.
Yes.
But go ahead. What stood out for you this week?
I think one of the things that I found very interesting was a refreshing amount of honesty about the politics behind all of this. We already mentioned the fact that the law was all but expressly targeted at public sector unions. Justice Rowe reiterated that point several times in the arguments about saying, I think at one point he said something like, the reality is that this law isn't going after billionaire plutocrats. This is targeting public sector unions. Another point that a different lawyer made for one of the interveners was that the only reason that this case was before the Supreme Court at all was because this voting rights issue had effectively tried to shoehorn a case into an area of the law to specifically to thwart the use of the notwithstanding clause, and had all sorts of warnings about that. I don't want to make it sound like there weren't actual, lawyerly arguments about constitutional principle and those important things. There definitely was a lot of that as well. But it was very clear that both the lawyers making their arguments and the justices hearing them really understood the centrality of the politics to all of this.
Sometimes when you listen to the questions that the judges ask the lawyers, you get a sense of how they're going to vote. Do you have a sense of how the court is going to weigh in on this?
I wouldn't say that I have a clear idea of, which justices are going to come down on either way. But I do think if you look at some of the recent precedents, I would be very surprised if the court decided to thwart the use of the notwithstanding clause in this case, if I could put it that way. We've already seen, actually, thanks to this Ford government, there was a recent case where, and I'm talking here about the Premier's decision to cut Toronto City Council in half back in 2018. That eventually went to the Supreme Court, and one of the issues was exactly how broadly do we define voting rights under the Charter. The Supreme Court, or at least a majority of the Supreme Court in that decision, held a more restricted view of voting rights, did not want to define it very broadly and expansively. So As I say, I would be very surprised if the Supreme Court adopted that more expansive view in this case. But as I will say again, I am not a lawyer, and we will see.
And life is full of surprises.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's why they have the cases. That's
Yes.
why they argue them. Okay, very good. And with that, it's on to issue 2. Doug Ford's government is nothing if not tough on crime. The Premier lets it be known whenever possible that he is pro-police and prepared to do whatever's necessary to prevent criminals from getting away with stuff. So it was with interest that we noticed this week that the province is offering some people charged with drunk driving offenses a deal. JMM, the details if you would.
So when you are pulled over by a police officer for drunk driving in Ontario, you could be charged with a criminal code violation. That's a federal law, or you could be charged with a breach of the Ontario Highway Traffic Act that generally carries milder penalties. Because Ontario's courts are so busy and clogged up at the moment, there are very probably good odds, I think you could say, that a full criminal case might not be heard in a timely fashion. And so the province has, during COVID and now since, has started taking to offering alleged drunk drivers a deal. They will downgrade the charges from a criminal charge to a provincial offense, and that means no lengthy criminal trial, no criminal record for the accused, but a speedier resolution, the government hopes.
Let's put this on the record right away. Obviously, this is not for people who drive drunk and injure somebody or, God forbid, kill somebody. These are lesser offenses. But the problem is, because of a Supreme Court decision some time ago called the Jordan case, if you don't get your case attended to by the justice system, as they say, in a timely fashion, judges have simply, in order to send a message to politicians, thrown cases out altogether. They say you are not adhering to people's rights to justice in a timely fashion if people end up waiting 2 and 3 and 4 years to get their cases held. So the thinking here is, at least we will be able to mete out some kind of penalty and help unclog the courts if we get people to accept this deal and go for the lesser penalties. But I'm interested in this story because I think it's a very interesting choice that this government has made, because this is one of those stories where the Ford government's brand as a tough-on-crime government runs headlong into the realities of a justice system that is overworked, doesn't have enough judges working in it right now. It is overextended. And interestingly enough, the Ford government has opted for a rather practical rather than ideological solution.
Right, and this comes, at least this news comes not long after the government announced that it was toughing the penalties for drunk driving, among other highway offenses that, we just talked about that last week.
Oh, car theft.
Right, car theft,
Yeah.
but also, drunk driving and others. As you say, it's an interesting moment for the government to choose, if we could put it, pragmatism as opposed to what they might be more comfortable doing it from a partisan lens. And, there's some substance here to the government's explanation. This isn't... they're not inventing the problem in the courts. The government did not write the Jordan decision. They would love to see fewer cases tossed because of these delays, but they have the reality that they have. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention, and some of the government's critics have pointed out that even with measures like this, even if we view it charitably as an attempt to streamline the administration of justice, there are still many hundreds of cases, certainly, that get tossed because of lengthy delays. Mm-hmm. So while this might be a good faith effort to address the backlog in the courts, it is on its own clearly not doing enough.
Right on. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Another story for you out of the justice system, this time involving all 3 orders of government. Let's start with the City of Toronto, which had applied for the right to decriminalize drug possession for personal use. When Premier Ford found out about it, he wrote to the Prime Minister saying, "This is the wrong way to go. Please do not give the capital city permission to do this." And now the feds have responded saying the project of the cities is a no-go. Once again, JMM, another fascinating example where expert testimony runs headlong into political reality, and this time political reality won out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess we could just go over the political reality here a bit more explicitly. You know, this subject makes a lot of people, a lot of voters uncomfortable. The idea of decriminalizing personal drug use, I mean, some people just have a genuine objection to the idea of decriminalization, and in particular how it has played out in other jurisdictions. It has also even people who might be sympathetic to the idea have had reservations. We have just seen in British Columbia, there was an effort to, well, there was in fact a decriminalization of personal drug use in BC, and the government there has walked that back. Now, that's not a Conservative government. That is an NDP government in BC, notably an NDP government that is now running for re-election.
Correct.
You know, there might be, I think, you know, in a perfect world, there might be a better argument for decriminalization if we had, you know, robust wraparound social services for people who are using drugs and people who are addicted. I'm not going to scandalize anybody by saying those wraparound services do not currently exist in Ontario. So even if the Prime Minister had been inclined to grant this request, even if the Mayor and the Premier and the Prime Minister could have all gotten on the same page, the politics have just made it functionally impossible.
The politics is very tough on this one, and we have seen, actually, Doug Ford, we have seen him use his political currency this past week very effectively. He is the head of a party that is at 40% in the polls right now, unlike Prime Minister Trudeau, who is leading a party which is closer to 20% in the polls right now. And Premier Ford was prepared to use some of his political capital on this issue in this way. His office, you know, obviously the office of the Premier of Ontario writes the office of the Prime Minister 15 times a day, 20 times a day, on all sorts of different topics. They don't normally, or very rarely, I should say, make those letters public. But this one they did. Yeah. And Premier Ford put the letter out there saying to the Prime Minister, do not let this happen. And the PMO clearly made a political decision along the lines of, we are getting hammered on too many fronts right now. We just cannot take on yet another fight, particularly against a premier of a big province where we need votes, and he's more popular than we are right now. Ideologically, I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister's office would have been inclined to side with the City of Toronto in this application for decriminalization. But right now, it's just too hot a political potato to handle.
No, I think you're right. And it's a shame because the problem that decriminalization was supposed to solve is still there, right? We have an absolutely devastating opioid crisis in Ontario. No less than Ontario's police chiefs have been among the loudest voices saying that criminal law is not really the proper way to deal with this. Right now, decriminalization is clearly not going to happen politically, but I don't know what solution anybody is offering instead. In particular, I don't see what solution the city, the province, and the feds could all agree on and implement.
At the moment, it seems impossible that all three levels are going to get on the same page on this one. And there we go. Okay, up next, your column, my column. Okay, it's time now for our regular feature, which we like to call Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org, this past week. Get us started, sir. What do you got?
So I wrote about the dismal state of Toronto's infrastructure, particularly its transportation infrastructure.
Is this something you've ever written about before?
Yeah, that and housing policy, right? The city has published a report recently looking at all of its capital assets, basically all of the big structures that the city owns, and there is some relative good news in there. Some parks are reasonably well kept. Other areas are doing all right, but the city is literally billions of dollars short of what it needs just to keep things in a state of good repair. We're not talking about actually, improving service levels. We're just the bare minimum to get things, to keep things running. And the point I wanted to make with this column is that I really don't believe we're actually saving ourselves any money here. When the subway breaks down in a morning rush hour, something that seems to happen more and more frequently these days, it forces everyone to either use more expensive alternatives or simply be late for work. And all of that has a real economic impact. I think that, is an important part of the conversation about why the city of Toronto historically has had very low property tax rates, needs to sort of suck it up and fund its capital responsibilities. But I also think there's a broader issue here. And, a lot of the time when we hear politicians talking about saving taxpayer money, some of that is undoubtedly true, but I do think that some of it is also shuffling costs around and taking costs that are normally borne by the government and saddling them on the backs of individuals.
Can I jump in with a question here?
Sure.
I mean, presumably the longer range solution to this is to find new and different sources of money for the city so that it can keep its infrastructure in a good state of repair. But where those sources come from, I mean, there's got to be a list of 50 different options on it, everything from a municipal sales tax to an extra hotel tax to getting more money from the feds, from the provinces. I don't know. Take your pick.
Yeah, and Mayor Olivia Chow has been using the example of the upcoming Taylor Swift Eras Tour concert in Toronto, saying that this will generate millions, if not tens of millions of dollars of economic activity that Ontario will benefit from, Canada will benefit from, and who won't benefit from? The City of Toronto.
Right.
The City of Toronto doesn't have access to sales tax. It doesn't have access to income taxes, but it's going to have to pay police overtime.
The city will.
Yeah, for the Taylor Swift concert. So, we need to have a broader discussion about how we equip cities to handle these kinds of costs. That has been ongoing for certainly more than a decade. Frankly, it goes back to the 1970s in some ways. I don't think there's any sign of that being resolved.
Speaking of which, are you going to take your kid to Taylor Swift's concert?
No, we saw the movie though.
Oh, you did?
Yes, we saw.
Okay. I still got to do that. I actually want to watch it. I mean, I don't know any of her music, but she's such a phenomenon. I figure I ought to know more about her, so I got to watch it.
Yeah, the movie's good. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and you know what? I have seen her in a Kansas City Chiefs uniform, so
well, there you go. Yes.
That much about her I know.
All right. How about you?
Okay, I actually want to mix it up a bit this week. I don't want to plug one of my own columns. I actually want to plug two other columns this week. The first one is by our pal Nam Kiwanuka, and in it she asks whether government priorities at all levels are aligning with the actual needs of constituents. And she makes the argument that all levels of government seem to be missing the mark these days in their priorities. And I think she plucked a couple of examples here. A lot of effort and expenditure on, for example, renaming Young Dundas Square, of which there is not a massive hue and cry out there to do it. Yeah. And yet at the expense of other things that maybe ought to have more of our attention. For example, she writes, in the country as a whole, while the GDP may be growing, people's immediate needs are not being met. The demand for food banks has broken records, including for first-time users and individuals working full-time. Some have nowhere to live but encampments. Many can't afford to buy a house, let alone rent. Now, this issue of encampments is something that we've been paying attention to. Absolutely. Particularly a few weeks ago, I wrote a piece when I was walking around downtown Hamilton, my hometown, and I saw this tent city sort of spring up in the square right outside City Hall. And I think the punchline of the piece I wrote was, we're going to have decision makers exhibit a hell of a lot more imagination if we're going to figure out how to solve this problem. Now, the encampment, that tent city at Hamilton City Hall is gone, but the problem isn't. I mean, they've just moved it somewhere else, right? So anyway, Nam's column is a good one on that, and we encourage people to have a look at it. The second column that I want to bring to people's attention actually isn't on our website. It is done by our friends at The Hub. This was, last Monday, Victoria Day. And you may notice we are one of the few jurisdictions in the world, maybe the only one left, that still has something called Victoria Day, a holiday Monday on the, whatever it is, third Monday in May?
Third
something
Monday
like that?
in May,
Okay.
yeah.
Anyway, John Fraser, who's a former journalist, former principal at Massey College, he's got a column on the Hub website exploring why, in this age of, if we can call it this, cancel culture, there apparently is no great campaign to cancel Queen Victoria. And the answer, according to John Fraser, is apparently because the Crown, under Victoria, and many Indigenous groups of her time made a lot of treaties, and there was considerable mutual respect at the time, and therefore there is no effort today, say unlike with John A. Macdonald or Edgerton Ryerson, to cancel Queen Victoria. And that's why this past Monday, we still had Victoria Day. There you go. So 2 columns for people's consideration.
And with that, let's go to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you. Send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, reach your hand into that virtual mailbag and pluck out a letter if you would.
Well, technically not the virtual mailbag this week. We are going to take a question from X, formerly Twitter. It is a follow-up to a question we had last week on online voting. Lorcas Hollins writes, good conversation. Regarding the question from the crowd about elections in Ontario, have SP and JMM explored compulsory voting as a mechanism to absolutely maximize voter turnout? Lots of interesting discussion, e.g. civic duty versus government overreach, even electoral reform. Worth a chat?
Worth a chat? I say yes, worth a chat. So let's do that now. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot first. Do you have a view on compulsory voting as they have in places like Australia, where they have compulsory voting and the turnout is like 96%, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that they do it in Australia and there's, I think it's a relatively minimal fine.
It's like a parking ticket. It's $50 or something.
It's enough to get people to go to the polls. You know, the fact that they do it in Australia, I think, is clearly an indicator that, you know, compulsory voting is not a slippery slope to absolute tyranny or anything like that. I do find myself wondering, just because we were talking about the charter earlier, like to force someone to vote is, you know, a change in their rights. Let me put it that way. Clearly, there are examples where the government is able to force us to do things, right? The government can force us to sit on a jury. They can force us to pay taxes in times of war. They can force us to serve in the military. And so for the civic good, you know, the government might be able to argue that now we're going to force you to vote. I would be very interested to see how that would play in the courts. And I don't know what the answer to that would be. Me, personally, yeah. We keep saying, like, we support high turnout here. It's one of the things we do support here.
We are not the target audience of this measure because we are. I've never missed a chance to vote in my life.
Yeah.
From the moment I turned 18, I have voted in every single election I could, and I bet you have too.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're not aiming at us. They're aiming at other people who may not want to vote. And I don't know. This would be, I think if you were at risk of getting a $50 fine for not voting, you might get off the couch and go out and make an effort to vote.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mentioned last week, you know, like online voting, this would not be the first thing I would propose. I think adding more days, that kind of thing, making it, there are lots of other ways to make it easier to vote that I would like to see governments do first, but I would not rule out the idea of compulsory voting.
I like the notion as well, because people have, when I've discussed this with other people in the past, they've said to me, well, what if I don't like any of them? And I say, well, okay, that is your right not to like any of them, but go to the polling station, take the ballot, and then refuse it. Or spoil it, or do something. Yeah. If you, like, to me, just not showing up at the polls doesn't really send the message to anybody strongly enough or clearly enough that you didn't like any of the options available on the ballot. If you take that ballot and you pass it back to the returning officer and say, I'm sorry, I am refusing my ballot because I don't like anybody, they have a special category for mentioning that.
Yes.
And therefore, that gets noted. So, I think it's growing on me. I think compulsory voting is growing on me. So thanks for sending us that tweet, because you did prompt a good little conversation there.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, that is the On Poly podcast for May 24th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback that you have for us, we're happy to hear it. Good, bad, or indifferent. Send us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org, and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
There may be one in your community. You may swim, be healed, or borrow a book inside of them. They are eye-catching and often spectacular. We're talking about mass timber buildings. They're mostly used now in public structures such as community centers, universities, and healthcare facilities. But our guest tonight will tell us that mass timber buildings could also help this province and country fill its affordable housing gap. And with that, we're joined by, in our nation's capital via Skype, Steve Kraft. He's principal with CHM Fire Consultants. And here in our studio, Philip Silverstein, principal at the architecture firm Moriyama Teshima. He's also coordinating construction of Limberlost Place at George Brown College in Toronto. Christopher Williams is here. He's a vice president at Timber Systems. That's a Markham, Ontario-based manufacturer of mass timber. And Ann Coven, a forester by training, now director of the Mass Timber Institute, also here in Toronto. And it's great to have you three here at our table. And Steve, thanks for joining us on the line from the nation's capital. And just, I think we got to start, Christopher, to you first. There'll be a lot of people who have no idea what we're talking about here. So let's just start with how mass timber is made to begin with that ends up building a building.
Certainly. Well, mass timber, just as a general concept, is large sections of timber that are made from smaller members of timber. So not like plywood or strand board, but 2x4s and 2x6s that are engineered and glued together in a fashion that allows us to make larger pieces that are more predictable from an engineering and strength perspective, that allow us to have the predictability that we need as engineers and designers to build larger and more complicated structures than we traditionally have.
Hardwood, softwood, doesn't matter?
It's all softwood. Technically, you could do it with hardwood, but all of the construction material that's done for timber construction in Canada is usually softwood lumber, primarily spruce pine fir or Douglas fir.
Okay, and I gather the technology behind all this started in Austria, which may be a bit unusual because you would think of a place with massive forests as being the place where this started, and they don't there. So how did that happen?
Yes, it's a curious question, but I think it really has to do with innovation. And the Austrians are very small land base, could easily fit many times over into Ontario, very little wood. Wood's expensive. And so really, I think their first motivation for innovating, exploring, developing mass timber products is really sustainability. They wanted to use every scrap of wood that they could for an engineered wood product. And so when you look at sustainability, the less wood you can use and optimize its sustainability by way of its cost, by way of, with respect to climate change, sequestering CO2. There are many ways to be sustainable, and I think the Austrians have done a good job in introducing it to us. And I'm excited because we've been making wood products, lumber and pulp and paper for 250 years, and we've been doing the same thing over and over again. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to innovate our forests and our supply chains.
This is new, no question about it. All right, let's talk about from an architectural perspective. What's the appeal?
The appeal? Oh, there's probably 100 things I could talk about. It's beautiful, it smells great, but really the appeal is the sustainability, the sequestering carbon nature of the material. It can be regrown. Concrete doesn't grow in trees, neither does steel. But to have a material you can use as your structural system that can be grown, harvested, it sequesters carbon. It's a miraculous material. It's a fifth the weight of concrete. And has the same structural properties or similar structural properties to concrete and steel. So it's a miraculous material, and the speed of construction, the labor force is lower than most traditional construction methods. So the appeal is really the sustainability.
Let's go to Steve in Ottawa because we want to bring our fire expert in at this point. And I know we've only been talking for a few minutes, but I can imagine people watching this or listening to this saying, wait a second, what about fire? So, what if people are going to ask, can't this stuff go up in fire? Can't it go up in flames? Is it as safe as steel and concrete? You've been doing the experiments. What do you know?
Yeah, so for the last 15 years, we've been doing fire tests on mass timber, both fire resistance tests. We've been doing tests on evaluating how it contributes to a fire in a building. And at the end of the day, we can design a mass timber structure to perform from a fire resistance perspective, so the ability to stay standing and in place for the same durations as we build steel and concrete buildings for. And we've also looked at, from a fire perspective, the performance of how the mass timber impacts the fire. So at the end of the day, we want to see that if we build a tall mass timber building, that it's going to perform similar to traditional materials, concrete and steel. And so what we're looking for is we want to see that in the event that the sprinklers fail to control the fire in the building, we want to see that the building's not going to be adversely, or it's not going to be impacted beyond what a steel or concrete building would happen. So we want to make sure that that building's not going to, for example, burn till it collapses, like we commonly see with perhaps a single family home.
So let me just clarify this, Steve. Steve, let me just clarify. Is a building out of wood intrinsically more flammable than a building made out of steel and concrete?
Intrinsically, yes. It will contribute to the fire, but at the end of the day, what we're looking for is performance that would be comparable to a steel or concrete building. So these buildings are sprinklered, and so it's rare that we would see in a high-rise mass timber building a fully developed fire. But in the case that we do, we want to make sure that the building's designed such that that fire can burn out on its own and not challenge the structure.
What can you do with mass timber that you can't do with concrete and steel?
So mass timber is very interesting for a variety of different reasons. And your earlier group, it was a very interesting discussion. The impact of mass timber design on health is effectively like a four-legged table, like this table, with health sitting on top of it. And design has a significant impact on ecological health, and that was the discussion, on your earlier panel. 1 cubic meter of wood is the equivalent of 3.5 cars driving for a whole year. So that's very important. The other important thing is design's impact on our physical health or our economic health. Clearly, wood is very important on economic health because a lot of the small communities in Ontario, this is, floating their boats, and that impacts societal health. But the important piece of the puzzle is we're not building these buildings just to solve the ecological thing, is we're building them to house people, and people gets back to performance. And so wood buildings has an impact, again, back on mind health, which is the asset-based view of it. And what do I mean by that? That if you look at the sound of wood, when you walk on a wood floor, that has an impact on your theta and beta waves in your mind, which is the stress side. It begins to reduce it and increases the calming side of it. The scent of cedar, that lovely, that sauna you go into, what that does is reduces your cortisol levels, which puts you in a better frame of mind for thinking. And visually, it is significant because it increases social interaction, relaxation. People want to linger and spend time together. If you look at it in schools, we use a lot of it in our school environments. Why? Because it enhances the performance of students on their tests.
So tell me this then. We've been hearing business and governments for decades complain about our lack of productivity in this country. You seem to have opened a potential door here that could see our numbers spike. What would have to happen in this country for there to be greater acceptance in a move towards doing more with this?
We are clearly in a period where we're beginning to take more of a holistic view of what we do and how we build. Why has that happened? Because we went through COVID. And why aren't we going back to the office? Because we've discovered there's somewhere else.
We don't like being in these tuna cans anymore that don't inspire us.
That's right, yeah. Because I perform better in these environments. And so obviously a lot of our working environments are problematic as a result of it. But I think we've begun to discover that, some places make us feel really great and others suck the life out of us. And so if it's all about human performance, where we live, where we work, where we heal, where we learn, the social interaction, the places we want to linger and spend time with, these things have a significant impact as a result of the places we crave.
The book is absolutely gorgeous, and you've got fantastic pictures in there of different places around the world where you are doing work. How about here in Canada? Are you catching on in Canada at all? You got some projects on the go you can tell us about?
We are. We have, in the education sector, we've been very, very busy, and in fact, a variety of independent schools, because they're connecting the dots between places that create social interaction and gathering and empathy and sharing. And then globally, we are very busy. We've got a dozen projects in Ireland. We're very busy in Europe. Israel, we've been very, very busy because a lot of the leadership are beginning to connect the dots between what their aspirations are as an organization and how you can use space as an accelerant to enhance the culture of the organization, the performance, or people just simply wanting to go back to the office.
I'm tempted to ask you, what's the least healthy building? I don't know, you know Toronto pretty well. Look around downtown Toronto or anywhere else, you look at a building that screams unhealthy to you. Which one?
Well, let me just flip that around slightly. Let's pick two very significant buildings in the city, and what do they communicate to you? So let's take the ROM and let's take the AGO.
Okay.
And so the ROM you come up to, it's got these sort of jagged shapes coming towards you, and a little mouse hole that you go into, which in fact they're renovating for a couple hundred, about 100 million or so, to open it up. When you walk inside, it's mostly drywall with angle walls and a little light. Let's take another cultural institution as a comparator. Let's take the AGO. When you come towards it at the entrance, the building begins to curve back. In fact, a lot of timber in that. There's a canopy that protects you in case it's raining or otherwise. And then when you come up into the gallery spaces, you've got this sort of timber that sort of fades open, and you look out onto the street. And in fact, even in the central space with a curving stair, that accentuates you to want to move through it.
Yes.
Because of the materials. Both of those communicate very, very different messages on how the environment makes you feel.
And I know which one you like better now.
Well, I'm just giving examples as opposed to a critique.
I get you.
Discussion.
45 years and only 2 mayors, right? Hazel McCallion and Bonnie Crombie, who of course has left to be the Ontario Liberal leader. So there is a by-election to replace her. Voting day is June the 10th. And if you haven't been following the campaign so far, Noor's going to get us all up to date here on who the main candidates are. Fire away.
Sure. So there's 20 people who are running for the mayor. There are clear frontrunners based on polling, and there's only been a few polls that have come out in the last month or two. And I think it's interesting that 4 members of council or previous members of council are running, and those are they have kind of become the frontrunners. Out of those, and based on polling, Carolyn Parrish, who is a I think household name for many in Canada, has had a clear lead in the polls, and a little bit behind her is Deepika Demirla, who's also well known in the Liberal MPP provincial circles, and Alvin Tedjo, who's a newbie on council, but he has also kind of been quite vocal on a lot of really progressive policies, and so he's been third. And Steve Dasko, who also is a councillor, has been kind of a close fourth, I guess you say. It's all very kind of, it's close pretty much at this point. So those are the 4 main front runners, but there is, 16 other candidates if people are looking for a different voice.
Right, and just to follow up, Carolyn Parrish, people might know because she was a longtime Liberal member of Parliament. Deepika Demirla was a member of the Ontario Legislature. Alvin Tedjo ran for the Ontario Liberal leadership against Stephen Del Duca. That was 2 contests ago. So those names may be familiar for that reason. Zachary, to you next. What do you think people are looking for in a mayor right now?
Well, they're looking for policy positions for sure. Housing is top of mind, absolutely. So is affordability. But looking back at Mississauga's recent history, I think what they're really looking for is a champion for the city. The last 2 previous mayors have been very, very vocal champions, very prominent provincial actors as well. And so I think that voters are also trying to look for someone who will fit that image to a certain degree, along with the sort of issue alignment that is affecting the city right now.
Sue, let me get you on that as well. What do you think people are looking for in their next mayor?
I think they're going to be looking for somebody that can be a leader for the city and a voice of the residents. I think that's kind of been lacking. And we need to have somebody that can be strong. We've got a lot of challenges facing us. We've got the province that we're dealing with. Bill 23, Bill 112. We've got a lot of...
No one knows what these numbers mean, so what are you talking about?
So Bill 23 is the More Homes Built Faster, which means that the Ford government is mandating intensification in Mississauga.
And some people like that and some people don't.
Exactly. Mississauga has an official plan, and it's got local area plans. It's got planners, it's got specialists, and they've been spent years coming up with these plans, and to have them trumped by the province is not necessarily a very good thing.
Okay, Rahul, how would you answer that question?
I think there's going to be a real contrast here. You know, it's interesting for being in the city itself. You're seeing a lot of celebration where Mississauga is also happening to turn 50 right now. And yet more people are not so much celebrating, but asking themselves, will I have a future in the city? What does the next 50 mean to me? Because we know, having reached our kind of urban boundary, we're not going to be able to build or move in the same way we always have. So I think there's going to be this potential disconnect, this risk of your traditional voter, who is fairly well established here. We know the voter turnout is low. What are their issues in contrast to the existing population that's having trouble to stay here? How are they going to continue to live here? How are they continue to move here? Will there be that kind of contrast between maybe a traditional voter's argument of crime and low taxes, as opposed to, well, we actually have a lot of things we need to find money for that we don't have right now?
You know, I remember, Sue, when you could buy a house in Mississauga for $100,000. What's the average price now?
I believe the average price is about $800,000.
No kidding. 800 grand for a house in Mississauga.
Absolutely.
Unbelievable.
And again, that's one of the big problems. How do you keep seniors staying in place, aging in place, and how can young people afford to stay in Mississauga?
Noor, I wonder if, you know, sometimes in these election campaigns, there's not a thimble's worth of difference among all the major candidates. How about in this one? Do they divert on any major issues in a major way?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's the one I've asked them all, is that, you know, your priorities are very similar, right? Affordability, more housing supply, you know, low crime, taxes. So how would anybody who's coming into this blind know who to vote for? You know, they do give me like a little bit, you know, an inch here or an inch there in terms of difference, but I think a lot of voters will look at if they're keen to look at the voting record of these candidates, they'll look at where, you know, certain candidates stand on, you know, social positions, international positions. You know, Mississauga is such a diverse community. A lot of people are looking at, I've heard from, you know, the Muslim community in particular, people are wondering like which politician has taken a position that's sympathetic to, let's say, what's happening in the Middle East, right? So people are looking at different things. It might not be a local priority. It might be an international priority. So I know that has come up. I think some candidates have taken clear positions on transit or biking lanes, that, you know, in terms of, do we want more biking lanes? Do we want to look at different ways to bring in biking lanes? There's been a lot of discussion around housing. You know, one candidate in particular has kind of come out as a more progressive candidate on housing.
Who's that?
Alvin Tedjo.
Okay.
So he's kind of seen as someone who's really pushing a very progressive vision, a lot more density, and more ways to kind of bring in the youth into it. And he's really kind of, I think, going for that youth vote, whereas someone like Carolyn Parrish, she's so well known for so many years. As you brought up, she's a federal MP and has been on council for decades. And so a lot of people who are well established, who know what they'll get, are kind of looking at Carolyn Parrish.
Zachary, can I get you to follow up on that? Any big cleavages among the candidates that you can see?
We haven't seen a ton on the policy front, but for me, one of the more interesting components is the generational shift between some of the candidates. Right, we have candidates who are more well known, who are established, who have been fixtures of the city's politics for 30+ years, and we have a younger generation of candidates too, who are being a little bit more progressive on things like housing, livability, stuff like that. So for me, that's one of the big things to sort of look at here as well, is what does a younger generation want? And there are certainly younger candidates who are willing to step up and champion some of those issues.
Chanel, start us off here. I want to get everybody's personal connection to Alice Munro off the top. What would you say is yours?
So I was introduced to Munro's writing at an early age, early high school, I think. It was Lives of Girls and Women, and I was 2 years into my life in Canada and had just become a teenager and all the complex feelings and emotions that come with that. And as a young immigrant to Quebec, to Canada, you know, I was navigating a country that was completely different than the small village that I grew up in on the small Caribbean island of St. Vincent. So I spent a lot of time alone during those early days, and I spent a lot of time in a library, and I think it was a librarian that actually handed me a Munro's book. And by reading her book, I was able to, find commonality between me and the female characters, especially the ones that were my age. And also it was about, they were set in small town Ontario, which is not that different than the village that I grew up in. There were a lot of similarities between the characters that we meet, the relationships that were happening in the stories. So yeah, so that's how I became, that's how I was introduced to Munro's writing.
Fabulous. Heather, how about you?
I first, of course, I had known the name, but I first read her when I was at McGill University, and I took a class in Canadian literature written by women, and it was a syllabus of 20 or 25 writers, and it was a huge class, one of these survey classes with 400 students. And the very last day of our semester, then the professor came in and she said, it's quite remarkable because every single student in this 400 to capacity class has chosen to write their final essay on Alice Munro. And it really struck me how there is something in her writing that responded to that everybody in the class connected to it. And, it was a class just filled with young women. And when you read Alice Munro, you think it's so intimate, such an intimate experience, and also of that sort of existential loneliness of being a young woman and having sort of a lack of resources and having to make these decisions on your own and everybody kind of curtails them and acts as though you're mad every time you do anything for your own happiness. So for me, it seemed like such a unique take, but everybody else in the class too was like, yes, I also love that idea that a young woman has the entire world and deserves the entire world, despite what everyone's telling her.
Lovely. Professor Redikoff, you not only liked her a great deal, you knew her and you decided to write a book about her. So where did the connection come from in the first place?
Well, I didn't know her when I decided to write the book about her. So in a way, my whole connection has been, I would say, uncanny in a way because of the connections that happened. Because before I ever thought of writing a book on Alice Munro, I did my PhD dissertation on James Hogg, having no idea that he's related to her. So then that was the first uncanny thing. And so then when I was in Scotland, after I had started to write, I was randomly asked by Methuen, which is now Routledge, British press, to write a book for their series on women authors, and I could choose either Atwood or Munro. And I had already published a bit on Atwood, and there were a lot of people publishing about her, so I decided I'll choose Munro because she's the bigger challenge, I thought. And so that's what I did. And then when I was in Scotland for a Hogg conference, somebody said, well, you're not going to work on Hogg anymore. What are you working on? And I said, Alice Munro. And they said, oh, she's related to James Hogg. And I said, no, you're kidding me. So that was the first uncanny connection. When I came back, I was working on the book and finally got up my courage to write her a letter and said, can this be true? And I sent her also I can't marvel at my temerity. I sent her a copy of an essay I'd written called Through the Mennonite Looking Glass, which was my first piece ever writing about being a Mennonite. And so she responded, everybody will understand, she responded generously she does to young writers.
Handwritten note?
Oh yes, my first handwritten letter in which she said, yes, it is true that she's related to James Hogg. And then a wonderful PS, and I must have apologized for the writing, how I had written that piece. And she said, no, that's right for that material. She's so generous to other writers. So that was my uncanny connection. It kept getting uncanny. And then when my book was I was towards the last of it, and I had gotten permission to have a painting by Mary Pratt called Wedding Dress on the cover of my book. I'd gone to Marigold Gallery and got that. And then suddenly I got a phone call from Douglas Gibson, said, I need to tell you a story. I'm coming to visit you on behalf of Alice Munro. And he came and he said that Alice Munro had chosen that same painting for the cover of Friend of My Youth. And so he was there on her behalf to ask if I would relinquish my right to it so that she could use it, and in exchange I could tell the story. So there have been other uncanny episodes.
And I assume
like
you did.
That.
You
Yes,
gave her
I
the
did.
green
Oh,
light?
yeah, that's what's on the cover of the book. Yeah,
Good stuff.
yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, Steve, I was a student also when I became aware of Alice Munro, and it was 1972. I was doing a master's degree in English at York University, and Lives of Girls and Women had been published the year before. And I have to tell you, after being a sort of honors English student in Edmonton all those years and searching desperately through the canon for women's names, was Evelyn Waugh possibly a woman? How about Rainer Maria Wilke? So there she was, and my thesis supervisor, my paper supervisor was a woman called Clara Thomas. And she said, this thing about Canadian women writers is becoming a real thing. We can now talk about it. This is a country that has produced and is producing a large number of women writers. And Alice was, to me, a leading edge of that. And what it meant to me was, hey, we can write about these things that are our experiences because we are in a special category as being women, and having been girls, we don't get quite the same space as everyone else. And also, she lived here. She made it possible. We didn't really have a big generation at that point of writers living in this country, writing about life in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Next week on the agenda.
Traditionally and historically, we haven't found value in people who have an intellectual disability. Quite frankly, we think that they're not as productive, they don't contribute as much, they're a net liability. And so you only invest in those things where you have priority, where you find value.
That's next week on the agenda.